chains were cold against Lyra's wrists, colder than the morning air pressing through the open doors of the auction hall. She did not look down at them. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on a crack in the stone wall across the room, because if she looked at the crowd, she would see their faces, and she did not want to see their faces. Lot number 14, the auctioneer called out, his voice bouncing off the high wooden beams above. A young Omega, healthy, of sound body. Starting bid, 200 coins. Silence. Lyra felt the silence settle over her like a second set of chains. She had expected jeers. She had expected laughter. She had not expected this, the terrible quiet of a room full of people who had already decided she was worth nothing. 200 coins, the auctioneer repeated, sweeping his gaze across the crowded benches. Come now, good sirs, good ladies. She is young, she is strong. A man in the third row leaned toward his companion and murmured something. Lyra caught only fragments of it, but she caught enough. Rejected. The word moved through the crowd like smoke, passing from mouth to mouth, growing heavier each time it was spoken. Rejected Omega. Damaged goods. Not worth the trouble. She had known the word would follow her here. She had known it the moment the guards dragged her from her home 3 days ago, the moment they threw her into the back of a cart with 6 other Omegas bound for the auction block. She had told herself she would not let it break her. She had told herself many things in the dark hours of that journey, and now, standing on the platform with the sun cutting through dust in the air, she was discovering how easy it was to make promises, and how hard it was to keep them. Nothing? The auctioneer asked, his patience thinning. Not one bid for lot 14? A woman near the front stood up and walked out, then another. The message was clear enough without words. Nobody wanted a rejected Omega, not even at a bargain price, not even as a servant, not even as a curiosity. In the eyes of the crowd, rejection meant flaw, and flaw meant danger, and danger was not something anyone wanted to bring into their home. Lyra's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. She would not cry. She had cried enough in the cart, in the holding cell, in the small hours before dawn when the guards were not watching. She had no tears left for this room full of strangers who did not know her name, let alone her story. The truth that none of them would ever hear, was that she had not failed her pack. She had refused it. There was a difference, though nobody in this hall seemed interested in the difference. All they saw was a word stamped onto her record, and a word was enough to close every door. 5 minutes, the auctioneer announced, glancing toward the clock mounted on the far wall. If no bid is placed within 5 minutes, Lot 14 will be returned to holding and reassigned to labor duty in the southern quarries. The quarries. Lyra had heard stories about the quarries, about Omegas sent there and never seen again, about the stone dust that settled into lungs and never left. She kept her face still, but her heart began to beat harder, a drum she could not silence no matter how she tried. She scanned the crowd despite herself, searching for any flicker of interest, any raised hand, any sign that she would not spend the rest of her life breaking rock under a merciless sun. She found nothing. Merchants whispered to each other. A young alpha yawned behind his hand. An old woman fanned herself with a folded paper, entirely uninterested in the business at hand. And then, near the back of the hall, half hidden by a support column, she noticed a figure who had not moved at all. He sat apart from the others, wrapped in a plain gray cloak with the hood pulled low, and while everyone else whispered and shifted and grew restless, he remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the platform. Fixed, she realized with a small jolt, on her. She could not see his face. She told herself it did not matter. One still stranger in a room of restless strangers did not change her situation. He was probably waiting for a different lot, a different auction entirely. She forced her eyes back to the crack in the wall and tried to steady her breathing. 4 minutes, the auctioneer said. Somewhere behind her, one of the other captive Omegas began to cry softly. Lyra recognized the sound. She had heard it every night since they were taken. She wished she could offer comfort, but her hands were bound, and there was nothing to say that would make the truth less true. The hooded man in the back had still not moved. 3 minutes. A ripple of noise passed through the front rows, the low murmur of people beginning to gather their belongings, preparing to leave once this uninteresting lot was cleared from the block. Lyra felt the quarries drawing closer with every passing second, felt the weight of her own helplessness pressing against her ribs. She had survived worse than this, she reminded herself. She had survived her own alpha turning cruel behind closed doors, had survived choosing her own safety over false loyalty, had survived being cast out and branded for it. She would survive this too, whatever this turned out to be. 2 minutes. The auctioneer's voice had lost its performance now, flattening into simple procedure. He was already glancing toward the guards stationed near the side door, silently instructing them to prepare for her removal. Lyra watched the guards straighten, watched them exchange a brief nod, and something inside her chest tightened painfully. She thought, absurdly, of her mother's garden back home, before everything had changed, before the pack, before the rejection, before any of it. She thought of soft dirt under bare feet and the smell of rain on stone. She held that image close, a small warm thing to carry with her into whatever came next. 1 minute, the auctioneer said, and cleared his throat, already composing the words that would send her south to the quarries. The hooded man rose from his seat. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to everything that had come before it, that a hush fell over the portion of the crowd near enough to notice. He did not hurry. He simply stood, tall and unhurried, his cloak settling around him as he stepped out from behind the column and into the aisle. Lyra's breath caught. She did not dare to hope. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing to carry into an auction hall. "You there," the auctioneer said, startled out of his flat recitation, his eyes narrowing at the newcomer. "Do you intend to bid?" The hooded man said nothing at first. He walked forward with unhurried steps, each one landing with quiet certainty on the wooden floor, until he stood at the edge of the center aisle, where every remaining eye in the hall could see him. "I do," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying easily through the hall without any need to raise it. Something about the timbre of it made the restless crowd fall entirely silent, the way a room falls silent when something important is about to happen, even before anyone understands what that something is. Lyra's heart pounded. She did not know this man. She did not know why he had waited until the very last moment, why he had let the room believe no one wanted her before finally speaking. But she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that everything about this moment was about to change. "Name your bid, then," the auctioneer said, recovering some of his composure, though his eyes remained fixed warily on the stranger. The hooded man lifted his gaze toward the platform, toward Lyra, and for the first time, she felt as though she were being truly seen, not as a rejected Omega, not as damaged goods, not as a problem to be solved by quarry labor, but as a person standing in front of him. 10,000 coins, he said. The number landed in the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Gasps rippled outward in every direction. The old woman with the fan stopped fanning herself entirely. The yawning alpha snapped fully awake. Even the auctioneer, a man who had surely heard every manner of bid in his long career, stood frozen for a long moment before he found his voice again. 10,000, he repeated, as though testing whether the words might change if spoken a second time. For lot 14. For her, the hooded man said, yes. Whispers exploded across the hall, 100 voices rising at once, speculation and disbelief tangled together into a roar of sound. Nobody paid 10,000 coins for a rejected Omega. Nobody paid 10,000 coins for any Omega, not even the most celebrated beauties brought from the finest houses in the capital. The sum was not a purchase price. It was a statement, though what exactly it stated, none of them could yet say. Lyra stood frozen on the platform, her chained hands trembling slightly at her sides, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. 10,000 coins. For her, the rejected one, the one nobody wanted. The auctioneer cleared his throat twice before he managed to speak again. Does anyone else wish to bid against this offer? Silence answered him, though it was a different silence now, not the silence of indifference but the silence of shock, of an entire room recalculating everything it had believed only moments before. Sold, the auctioneer said, his voice slightly unsteady. Lot 14, sold for 10,000 coins. The hooded man did not smile, did not celebrate, did not react at all beyond a small, satisfied nod, as though the outcome had never truly been in doubt. He turned toward the side of the platform where the guard stood waiting to process the sale, and Lyra watched him move, with the same unhurried confidence he had shown from the very beginning. She still could not see his face clearly beneath the hood, but she could feel the weight of his attention settling on her once more. steady and unshaken by the whispers still swirling through the hall around them. Whoever this stranger was, he had just changed the course of her life, with 11 words, and a sum of coin, that most people would never see in a lifetime. The guards moved to unlock the chains binding her to the platform post, their earlier boredom replaced now with something closer to caution, even respect. One of them glanced toward the hooded man, and gave a small, deferential nod before turning the key. Lyra rubbed at her freed wrists, the skin raw and marked from days of restraint, and tried to steady the storm of questions racing through her mind. Who was this man? Why had he waited until the very last moment? Why had he paid a sum that made an entire hall gasp for a woman that same hall had just spent an hour deciding was worthless? She did not know whether to feel relief or fear. Perhaps, she thought, watching him approach the platform steps with that same unhurried certainty, she should feel both. "Come," the hooded man said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear it clearly over the continuing murmur of the crowd. "You do not belong on that platform any longer." Lyra hesitated only a moment before stepping down, her legs unsteady after so many hours of standing still. He did not reach for her, did not grip her arm the way the guards had, the way her old pack had once done when they wanted to remind her of her place. He simply waited, giving her the space to move on her own terms, and something about that small gesture struck her more deeply than the 10,000 coins ever could. As she reached the bottom of the steps, close enough now to see the edge of his jaw beneath the hood, close enough to catch the faint scent of pine and steel that clung to him, one thought settled into her mind with startling clarity. Whoever he was not like anyone she had ever known before. And as the crowd continued to whisper his impossible bid to one another, as the auctioneer moved on to the next lot with visible relief at putting the strange moment behind him, Lyra found herself walking beside a stranger toward a future she could not begin to predict, carrying only the clothes on her back, the marks on her wrists, and a small, cautious ember of something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The carriage waiting outside the auction hall was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen up close. Its wood was dark and polished, its wheels bound in iron, and 2 horses stood harnessed at the front, their coats brushed to a gleaming shine. She stopped a few steps away from it, suddenly unsure whether she was meant to climb inside or wait for some instruction. "It is safe," the hooded man said, noticing her hesitation. "No one will touch you here." Lyra studied him carefully, still unable to see much beyond the shadow of his hood, though the line of his jaw suggested a man in the prime of his years, not old, not young, but settled into a kind of quiet strength. "You paid 10,000 coins, she said, her voice rougher than she intended, worn from days of silence. "For me? Why?" "Not now," he said, not unkindly, but firmly enough that she understood the conversation would wait. "There are too many ears in this square." She glanced around and saw what he meant. A small crowd had gathered near the steps of the auction hall, watching the 2 of them with open curiosity, some pointing, some whispering behind raised hands. The story of the 10,000 coin bid would spread through the town before nightfall, she realized, and probably far beyond it before the week was through. She climbed into the carriage without further argument. The interior was lined with soft cushions, a small woven blanket folded neatly on one seat, a water skin resting beside it. Someone had prepared this space in advance, she noticed. Someone had known they would need it. The hooded man climbed in after her but did not sit close. He took the seat across from her, leaving a respectful distance between them, and rapped twice on the carriage wall. A moment later, the wheels began to turn, and the auction hall fell away behind them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Lyra watched the town pass by through the small window, watched market stalls and stone houses give way to open fields, and tried to steady the trembling that had settled into her hands since the moment the chains came off. She reached for the water skin, drank slowly, and felt some small measure of strength return to her. "You may lower your hood now," she said finally, surprising herself with her own boldness. "If you intend to keep me from starving or freezing, the least you owe me is a face to remember." A pause followed, long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped. Then, slowly, he reached up and drew the hood back from his head. He was younger than she had expected, though not young in the way the boys at the auction had been young. His hair was dark, cut short and neat, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a deep and steady gray, the color of storm clouds before rain. There was a quiet weight to his expression, the look of a man who carried more responsibility than most people ever would, and beneath that weight, an unmistakable current of restrained power. "My name is Cale," he said. The name meant nothing to her at first, and then, slowly, pieces began to click into place. She had heard that name before, whispered in markets and taverns, spoken with a mixture of respect and fear. Cale, the Alpha King, ruler of the Northern Territories, the man who had rebuilt a broken kingdom from the ashes of a war fought before she was born. "You are the king," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," he confirmed, watching her reaction carefully, as though bracing for fear, or worse, for the kind of desperate flattery he had likely encountered 1,000 times before, from people hoping to gain his favor. Instead, Lyra felt something colder settle in her stomach. "Then why," she asked slowly, "would a king spend a fortune on a rejected Omega no one else wanted? What use could I possibly be to you?" Something flickered across his face, there, and gone too quickly for her to name it. "Not every reason is about use," he said. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe," she said. "I have met very few people in my life who do things without reason, and fewer still who do them without expecting something in return." Cale studied her for a long moment, and instead of anger at her sharp words, something almost like approval settled into his expression. "You are right to be cautious," he said. "I would think less of you if you were not, but I did not bid on you to claim ownership, Lyra, nor to demand anything from you that you are unwilling to give." She startled slightly at the sound of her own name in his mouth. "How do you know my name?" "The auction records," he said simply. "I read them before the sale began. I read every name on that list, in fact, though only one of them stayed with me." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, watching him instead, trying to understand what kind of man sat across from her in this quiet carriage. "I was traveling through the region under disguise," he continued after a moment, "to see with my own eyes the conditions in the border territories, conditions my advisors insist are improving, and which I have learned, more than once, are not improving nearly as much as I am told. I did not expect to find an auction hall willing to send a healthy young Omega to the quarries simply because a single word had been attached to her name." "Rejected," Lyra said quietly, testing the word aloud, feeling its familiar weight settle over her again. "A word," Cale said, "that tells me nothing about who you are, only what someone else decided to call you." Lyra turned her face toward the window, watching the fields roll past, feeling something unfamiliar stir behind her ribs, something she did not yet have a name for, and was not certain she wanted to examine too closely. "It is not that simple," she said. "Words like that follow a person. They close doors. They make people afraid, or cruel, or both. I imagine they do," Cale said. "But a word is not a fact, and I have learned over the years not to mistake the two." They rode in silence for a while after that, the carriage rocking gently along the road, the sound of hooves against packed earth filling the space between them. Lyra found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking, trying to reconcile the stories she had heard, tales of a fierce and unyielding king, with the quiet, careful man sitting across from her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked eventually. "To the capital," he said. "To my palace, for now. You will have your own quarters, your own privacy, and no obligations beyond what you choose to accept. If, after some time, you wish to leave, I will not stop you." "That seems like a strange promise for a king to make," she said. "Kings do not typically let go of what they have paid for." "I did not pay for a possession," Cale said, his voice steady. "I paid to remove you from a situation that would have destroyed you, whether through the quarries or through whatever cruelty might have followed you elsewhere. What you do with the freedom that follows is entirely your own choice." Lyra wanted to believe him. Some old, worn-down part of her wanted desperately to believe that kindness without a hidden price still existed somewhere in the world, but experience had taught her to be wary of exactly this kind of gentle promise, the kind that so often turned to demand once trust had been earned. "And if I choose to stay silent," she said carefully, "and simply observe you, before I decide whether to trust a single word you have said?" For the first time since he had lowered his hood, something close to a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Then I would think you were being sensible," he said. "I would expect nothing less from someone who has survived what you have survived." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie she was certain must be hiding somewhere in his calm expression, and found, to her own surprise, that she could not locate it. The carriage rolled on through the afternoon, the fields giving way eventually to low hills dotted with farmhouses, smoke curling from chimneys in the distance. Lyra watched the changing landscape, aware of Cale's quiet presence across from her, aware too of the strange, uncertain feeling settling into her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite trust, it was not quite safety, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of both. As the sun began its slow descent toward the hills, casting long golden light through the carriage window, Cale spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "I do not know what happened to you before today," he said. "I do not need you to tell me, not unless you wish to, but I want you to know that whatever it was, it does not define what happens next." Lyra turned to look at him, at the steady gray eyes that seemed to hold no trace of the cruelty she had learned to expect from those with power over her. "That is a kind thing to say," she said softly. "I only hope it turns out to be true." "It will," Cale said, and there was something in the certainty of his voice that made her almost believe it entirely. The carriage continued onward, carrying them both toward the capital, toward a palace full of whispers and suspicion that neither of them could yet fully imagine, and toward a future that had, in the span of a single afternoon, become something neither of them had expected it to be. The carriage jolted hard over a rut in the road, and Lyra's hand shot out to steady herself against the seat, her heart lurching with the sudden movement. Outside, she heard raised voices, the sound of hooves pulling up sharp, and Cale's expression shifted instantly from calm to alert. "Stay low," he said, his voice dropping to something hard and commanding, so different from the quiet tone he had used moments before that it startled her more than the jolt of the carriage itself. She pressed herself back against the cushions as he leaned toward the small window, scanning the road ahead. Through the gap in the curtain, Lyra caught sight of several riders blocking the path forward, their horses arranged in a loose line, their postures tense with purpose rather than accident. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Border raiders," Cale said quietly. "Or men dressed to look like them. Either way, they are not here by chance." The carriage rolled to a stop, despite Cale's evident wish otherwise, and a voice called out from beyond the door, rough and demanding. "Driver, hold your horses. State your business on this road." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Lyra saw something pass through his eyes that she recognized instantly, the same hard, cornered look she had worn on the auction platform only hours before. He did not reach for a weapon, did not raise his voice, but something in his stillness carried a different kind of threat entirely, the quiet readiness of a man who had faced far worse than a handful of riders on a country road. The carriage door opened before she could respond, and a broad-shouldered man leaned inside, his eyes sweeping first over Cale and then settling on Lyra, with an expression she did not like at all. "Well now," the man said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "An Omega traveling without a collar, that is a valuable thing to find on an empty road." "She is under my protection," Cale said, his voice even, though Lyra could hear the steel running beneath it. "You would be wise to close that door and let us pass." The man laughed, glancing back over his shoulder toward his companions. "Protection," he repeated, as though the word amused him. "And who exactly are you to offer protection, cloaked traveler? A merchant? A minor lord playing at authority he does not have?" Cale reached up and drew back his hood fully, the same gesture he had made in the carriage only an hour before, though this time the effect on the man in the doorway was immediate and dramatic. His grin faltered, his eyes widened. He took an involuntary step back from the carriage door. "Your Majesty," he stammered, all trace of bravado gone from his voice. "You have 5 seconds," Cale said, "to remove yourself and your men from this road, before I decide that your presence here constitutes a threat to the crown." The man did not need 5 seconds. He turned and shouted something urgent to his companions, and within moments, the sound of hooves retreating filled the air, the riders scattering back the way they had come, as quickly as their horses could carry them. The carriage door swung shut, and silence settled once more over the interior. Lyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "They knew your face," she said. "Even hooded, they suspected." "Word travels faster than carriages," Cale said, settling back into his seat, though the tension had not entirely left his shoulders. "News of the auction will already be moving through the countryside. Men like that survive by knowing which travelers to avoid and which to test. And if you had not revealed yourself, she asked, what would have happened then? Kale met her eyes steadily. I would have handled it, he said, and something in the simple certainty of his tone told her that this was not an idle boast, but a plain statement of fact. The carriage began to move again, the driver urging the horses back into a steady pace, and Lyra found herself studying Kale with new eyes. She had known, in the abstract way that stories are known, that he was a warrior as much as a ruler, that he had fought in the war that shaped the kingdom before either of them had come of age. But seeing the readiness in him now, the quiet, coiled strength beneath his calm exterior, made the stories feel suddenly real in a way they had not before. Does this happen often? She asked. Traveling in disguise, being stopped on the road? More often than my advisors would like, Kale admitted, a faint, wry note entering his voice. They would prefer I stay within palace walls and let reports come to me instead. But reports can be shaped, Lyra. A man who wishes to hide the truth from his king need only control what reaches the king's ears. I have found it far more useful to see conditions with my own eyes. She asked, to see the truth for yourself? Partly, Kale said. I had heard troubling accounts from the border territories, tales of auctions run with little oversight, of omegas sold into conditions no better than servitude, sometimes worse. I intended only to observe, to gather what I needed to bring real reform before my council. I did not intend to bid on anyone. Then why did you? She asked again, the question that had haunted her since the moment he rose from his seat in the auction hall. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the darkening fields beyond. Because I watched a room full of people decide, without knowing a single true thing about you, that you were worthless, he said finally. And I have spent too many years of my life being underestimated by people who thought they understood my worth, from a glance to stand by and watch the same thing happen to someone else. Lyra did not know how to answer that. The words settled into her chest, with a warmth she was not prepared for, unfamiliar, and slightly unwelcome in its intensity. She had spent so long guarding herself against exactly this kind of feeling, the dangerous comfort of believing someone finally understood her, that she did not know how to hold it without also fearing it. You speak as though you know what it is to be underestimated, she said carefully. A king. Underestimated. Something shifted in Kale's expression, a shadow passing briefly across his features, before he mastered it again. I was not always a king, he said. There was a time, before the war ended, when very few people believed I would survive to become one. I remember what it feels like to stand in a room and watch people decide your value before you have spoken a single word. What happened? She asked, curious despite herself. That is a story for another time, Kale said, though not unkindly, and Lyra found she did not push the matter further. She understood, better than most, the value of choosing one's own moment to share old wounds. The carriage rolled on through the gathering dusk, the fields eventually giving way to the outer villages that ringed the capital, small clusters of stone houses with lanterns glowing warm in their windows. Lyra watched the passing scenery, aware of the strange new quiet that had settled between herself and the king across from her, a quiet that felt less like distance now, and more like understanding. We will reach the palace before midnight, Kale said eventually, breaking the silence. You should rest, if you are able. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. What kind of challenges? She asked, a note of wariness creeping back into her voice. My court, Kale said simply, does not always share my view of things. There will be those who question my judgment in bringing you there. I will not pretend otherwise. Lyra felt a familiar tightness settle in her stomach, the old, worn fear of judgment rising up again despite everything that had happened since the auction. And if they succeed in changing your mind? She asked quietly. If enough voices convince you that I am not worth the trouble you have taken. Kale leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. No voice in my court carries more weight than my own judgment, he said, and my judgment has already been made. She wanted to believe him completely. Some fragile, hopeful part of her did believe him, at least a little. And as the carriage carried them onward through the darkening countryside toward whatever waited within the palace walls, Lyra allowed herself, cautiously, to hold on to that belief a little longer. The palace gates rose out of the darkness, like something carved from the night itself, Tall iron bars threaded with torchlight, guards standing at rigid attention as the carriage rolled through. Lyra pressed her face closer to the window despite herself, unable to hide her wonder at the sheer scale of the place. Towers stretching upward into the black sky, windows glowing gold across a stone facade wider than any building she had ever seen. "It is a great deal to take in on a first arrival," Cale said, watching her reaction with quiet amusement. "Most visitors have months of preparation before they see it. You have had an afternoon." "I did not expect to see it at all," Lyra admitted. "This morning I expected to be sent to a quarry." Something flickered across his face at that, gone before she could name it, though she thought it might have been anger, quickly suppressed. "That is not a fate I intend to let happen to anyone, if I can prevent it," he said. The carriage came to a stop in a wide courtyard, and before Lyra could gather herself, the door opened, and a young woman stepped forward to greet them, her posture formal but her eyes warm. "Your Majesty," she said, dipping into a quick bow. "We received word ahead of your arrival. Rooms have been prepared." "Thank you, Nora," Cale said, stepping down from the carriage and turning to offer Lyra a hand, which she accepted after only a brief hesitation. "This is Lyra. She will be staying with us. See that she has everything she needs." Nora's eyes moved over Lyra with open curiosity, though nothing unkind showed in her expression, only careful assessment. "Of course, Your Majesty," she said, then turned to Lyra with a small, genuine smile. "Welcome. I imagine it has been a very long day." "It has," Lyra admitted, grateful for the simple kindness in the woman's tone. Cale did not linger long after the introduction. "I have matters that require my attention tonight," he said, his gaze settling briefly on Lyra. "Nora will see to your comfort. We will speak again tomorrow." He turned and strode off toward the palace's grand entrance, his cloak billowing behind him, and Lyra watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and reluctance, uncertain why the second feeling had crept in at all. "Come," Nora said gently, drawing her attention. "Let me show you to your rooms. You must be exhausted." Lyra followed her through a side entrance and up a narrow staircase, lit by soft lantern light, the sounds of the busier main halls fading behind them. "How long have you served here?" she asked, mostly to fill the silence, though genuine curiosity lingered beneath the question. 5 years, Nora said. "I came here much as you did, in a sense, though under far less dramatic circumstances. His Majesty took in a number of us who had nowhere else to go after the war years. He does not speak of it often, but he has never turned away someone in genuine need." "Even Omegas the rest of the world considers worthless?" Lyra asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice entirely. Nora paused at the top of the staircase and turned to look at her directly. "Especially those," she said. "I do not know your story, and I will not ask unless you wish to share it. But I can tell you this much. Whatever brought you here, His Majesty does not make such choices lightly, and he does not make them for show." They reached a set of carved wooden doors, and Nora pushed them open to reveal a room far grander than anything Lyra had ever slept in. A wide bed draped in soft linens, a window overlooking dark gardens below, a fire already crackling in the hearth to chase away the evening chill. "This is mine?" Lyra asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "For as long as you wish it to be," Nora said. "There is a bath prepared through that door, and fresh clothing in the wardrobe, should you want it. If you need anything else, simply ring the bell by the bed, and someone will come." Lyra murmured her thanks, and Nora offered one final smile before slipping quietly from the room, leaving her alone for the first time since the auction that morning. She stood in the center of the space for a long moment, simply breathing, allowing the reality of the day to settle slowly over her. She crossed to the window and looked out over the gardens below, dark shapes of hedges and trees barely visible in the moonlight, and found herself thinking again of Cale, of the strange steadiness in his manner, of the way he had spoken of underestimation, as though he understood it from the inside, rather than simply observing it from a distance. The bath, when she finally allowed herself to use it, was warmer and more comfortable than anything she had experienced, in longer than she could remember. She scrubbed away the dust and grime of the auction hall, the marks of days spent in a holding cell, and dressed afterward in a simple gown left folded in the wardrobe, soft fabric against skin that had grown used to rougher cloth. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind turning over the events of the day again and again, the humiliation of the auction block, the shock of the bid, the tension on the road, the quiet strength in Cale's manner as he faced down the men who had stopped their carriage. She had spent so long expecting cruelty from those with power over her that she did not quite know what to do with kindness, offered so plainly and so consistently. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the curtains, and Lyra woke to the sound of a soft knock at her door. Nora entered a moment later, carrying a tray of bread and fruit, her expression brighter than it had been the night before. "His Majesty requests your presence in the garden this morning," she said, setting the tray down on a small table near the window. "Whenever you are ready, there is no urgency." Lyra ate slowly, gathering her thoughts, and dressed in another simple gown, before making her way down through the quiet palace corridors, toward the gardens Nora had described. She found Cale standing near a stone fountain, dressed now in clothing far plainer than she might have expected of a king, his attention fixed on the water rippling in the morning light. "You slept well, I hope," he said, turning as she approached. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "This is all still difficult to believe." "I imagine it will take time," Cale said. "I do not expect you to trust any of this immediately. Trust of that kind is not something that can be commanded, only earned." They walked together along a gravel path lined with early blooming flowers, and Cale spoke of the palace grounds, of the history behind certain buildings, of small details that revealed a man who cared more deeply for his kingdom than the stories she had heard suggested. Lyra found herself listening more closely than she intended, drawn in despite her lingering wariness. "There is something I must tell you," Cale said eventually, his tone shifting into something more serious. "Not everyone within these walls will welcome your presence. There are those in my court who believe I acted rashly at the auction, who will look for reasons to question your place here." "I expected as much," Lyra said. "I am accustomed to being questioned." "You should not have to be," Cale said, a note of quiet frustration entering his voice. "But I will not lie to you about the difficulties ahead. I only ask that you allow me the chance to stand beside you when those difficulties arise, rather than facing them entirely alone." Lyra studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any trace of the hidden agenda she had expected from the very beginning, and found, once again, only steady sincerity looking back at her. "Very well," she said finally. "I will allow it." Something eased in Cale's shoulders at her answer, a tension she had not noticed until it released. "Then let us begin," he said, and together they continued along the garden path, toward whatever challenges the palace had waiting for them both. The council chamber doors burst open before Cale had even finished crossing the garden threshold, and a tall woman in a deep blue gown strode toward them, with the kind of purposeful anger that made servants scatter from her path. Lyra recognized the look on her face instantly, the same cold assessment she had seen 100 times before, in the eyes of those who considered themselves above her. "Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice sharp even as she offered the required bow. "I had hoped the rumors from the border auction were exaggerated." "Duchess Miriam," Cale said, his tone even, though Lyra noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the readiness that had appeared on the road the day before, settling once more into his shoulders. "I do not believe we were expecting you until next week." "I rode through the night when I heard the news," Miriam said, her eyes flicking toward Lyra with open disdain. 10,000 coins, spent on a rejected Omega, purchased in full view of merchants and border lords, who will carry the story to every court in the realm, within the month. "Do you understand what this does to your standing?" "I understand precisely what I did, and why," Cale said. "What I do not understand is why my personal decisions require your immediate involvement, Duchess." Miriam's jaw tightened, but she pressed on regardless. "Because your standing is not merely personal, Your Majesty. It belongs to the kingdom. Every alliance we have built since the war rests on the perception of your judgment, your strength, your discipline. A king who bids a fortune on damaged goods invites exactly the kind of ridicule our enemies would delight in spreading." Lyra felt the familiar heat of shame rising in her chest at the words, though she forced her expression to remain still, refusing to give the Duchess the satisfaction of a visible reaction. She had endured worse insults than this, spoken by crueler mouths than the Duchess possessed. "Careful, Duchess," Cale said, his voice dropping into something colder than Lyra had yet heard from him. "You speak of her as though she cannot hear you standing directly before you." Miriam's eyes widened slightly, though she recovered quickly. "My apologies," she said, though the words carried no real warmth. "I did not intend disrespect. I intend only to protect the interests of the crown." "Then trust that I have already considered those interests," Cale said. "My judgment in this matter is not open for debate." The Duchess studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to press the argument further, before finally offering a stiff bow and retreating back toward the council chamber, though not without one final glance toward Lyra, a look that promised this was far from the end of the matter. "I apologize for that," Cale said once she had gone, his voice softening again. "The Duchess has never learned the value of patience." "She is not entirely wrong," Lyra said quietly. "About how this looks to others." "Perhaps not," Cale admitted. "But she is entirely wrong about what matters most in this decision, and that is not something I intend to reconsider, simply because it makes certain conversations uncomfortable." They continued through the palace corridors together, and Lyra noticed the stares that followed them, servants pausing mid-task to watch, nobles exchanging whispered glances behind raised hands. She had grown accustomed to being watched with contempt, but there was something different in these glances, a mixture of curiosity and calculation that unsettled her in a new way. "They are wondering what you are to me," Cale said, noticing the direction of her gaze. "Whether you are a passing fancy, a political statement, or something else entirely. I imagine the theories being exchanged behind those closed doors are considerably more colorful than the truth." "And what is the truth?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious now. Cale considered the question for a long moment before answering. "The truth is that I am still discovering it myself," he said. "I only know that leaving you on that platform was never something I could have done." They arrived eventually at a smaller study, quieter than the grand halls they had passed through, where a stack of papers sat waiting on a wide desk. Cale gestured for her to sit, and she did, watching as he settled into the chair across from her, rather than behind the desk itself. A small choice that felt deliberately equalizing. "I want to know more about what happened before the auction," he said carefully. "Not because I require an explanation to justify what I have done, but because I believe understanding your past will help me protect your future here. The court will look for weaknesses to exploit. I would rather know the truth from you than let them construct their own version of it." Lyra hesitated, old instincts urging her toward silence, toward the same guardedness that had kept her safe through years of difficulty. But something in Cale's steady patience, in the way he had defended her without demanding anything in return, made her consider, for the first time, actually speaking the truth aloud. "My former Pack Alpha was not a good man," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "He ruled through fear rather than respect, and he expected obedience even when his demands crossed lines that should never have been crossed. I refused him, more than once. The rejection was not because I failed some test of worth. It was because I would not bend to cruelty simply because it wore the mask of authority." Cale's expression darkened, though the anger in it was not directed at her. "And for that refusal, you were branded rejected and sent to auction like livestock," he said, his voice low. "Yes," Lyra said simply. "That is not failure," Cale said. "That is courage, of a kind most people never find the strength to show." Something in his words settled deep into her chest, warm and unfamiliar, the first time anyone had spoken of her rejection as anything other than shame. "Most people would not see it that way," she said quietly. "Most people have not faced what you faced," Cale said. "I have seen enough cowardice disguised as obedience in my own court to recognize genuine courage when it stands in front of me." They sat together in a comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation settling gently between them, rather than pressing down with the discomfort she had expected. Eventually, Cale rose and moved toward the window, looking out over the palace grounds below. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Your former Pack Alpha may not simply let this matter rest. Men like that rarely accept a loss of property, even one they claim to have already discarded." Lyra felt a familiar chill settle over her at the words. "You think he will come for me," she said. "I think it would be foolish to assume otherwise," Cale said. "But know this, whatever comes, you will not face it from that auction platform again, alone and unwanted. You face it now, from within these walls, with the full weight of the crown behind you." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his words against the fear that still lingered from years spent believing herself powerless against the will of others. Slowly, cautiously, She allowed herself to believe that this time, the promise might actually hold true. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kale turned back toward her, something gentle passing across his usually guarded expression. "You do not need to thank me for simply doing what is right," he said, "but you are welcome all the same." A sharp knock at the study door interrupted the quiet moment, and Nora entered quickly, her expression tight with urgency. "Your Majesty," she said, "a rider has arrived at the gates. He claims to represent a Pack Alpha from the border territories, and he is demanding an audience regarding a matter of property." Lyra's stomach dropped instantly, the warmth of the previous moment vanishing as though it had never existed. "Property," she repeated, her voice tight. "He means me." "We do not know that for certain," Kale said, though the grim set of his jaw suggested he suspected exactly the same thing. "Bring the rider to the smaller receiving hall," Kale instructed Nora. "I will hear him there, alone." "I want to be present," Lyra said quickly, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. Kale studied her for a moment, weighing the request. "It may be difficult to hear what he has to say," he said carefully. "I have heard worse," Lyra said. "I would rather face it directly than imagine it from behind a closed door." After a moment, Kale nodded. "Very well, but you will stand beside me, not before me." They made their way to the receiving hall, a smaller and more private space than the Grand Council chamber, where a travel-worn rider stood waiting, his clothing marked with the emblem of a pack Lyra recognized instantly, the twisted iron insignia of her former alpha, a man named Damon Voss. "Your Majesty," the rider said, offering a bow that seemed more perfunctory than respectful. "I bring word from Alpha Voss regarding an Omega recently purchased at auction, one previously registered under his pack's authority." "Speak plainly," Kale said. "What does your master want?" "Alpha Voss wishes to inform you that the rejection recorded against this Omega was issued in error," the rider said, glancing briefly toward Lyra before continuing. "He requests her return, along with appropriate compensation for the inconvenience caused by her wrongful sale." Lyra felt anger rise hot and sudden in her chest, the injustice of the claim so absurd she nearly laughed despite the seriousness of the moment. "Wrongful sale," she repeated. "He rejected me himself, before witnesses, and had me dragged from the pack grounds in chains." The rider's expression flickered, though he held his composed posture. "I carry only the message I was given," he said. Kale's expression had gone entirely still, the calm mask of a king, carefully containing something far more dangerous beneath it. "Tell your master this," he said, his voice low and even. "The purchase was made in full accordance with the laws of this kingdom, at public auction, witnessed by dozens. If he wishes to contest the legitimacy of a rejection he issued himself, he is welcome to bring the matter before the royal court, where he will answer for the conditions under which that rejection occurred." "Alpha Voss believed you would prefer to settle this matter privately," the rider said carefully, "rather than invite scrutiny into pack affairs before the full court." "Alpha Voss," Kale said, "does not know me nearly as well as he believes he does. Tell him I look forward to hearing his account of events before witnesses, under oath, should he choose to pursue this claim formally." The rider's composure faltered slightly at that, and after a brief hesitation, he bowed again and departed, clearly recognizing that his mission had failed to achieve the quiet resolution his master had hoped for. Once the hall had emptied, Lyra turned to Kale, her hands trembling slightly from the encounter. "He will not simply let this go," she said. "Men like Damon do not accept refusal easily." "No," Kale agreed. "He will likely attempt to invoke old pack law, some ancient claim of unbroken ownership, to argue that the rejection itself was never properly finalized. It is a common tactic among alphas seeking to reclaim what they consider lost property." "Can he succeed?" Lyra asked, fear creeping back into her voice despite her best efforts to control it. "Not while I stand against him," Kale said firmly. "But I will not pretend the path ahead will be simple. Pack law carries real weight in the courts. Weight I will need to counter carefully and deliberately, not through anger alone." Lyra felt the fear settle into something colder and more familiar, the sense of a battle she had fought before, alone, and lost. "I have faced him before," she said quietly. "I know what he is capable of when he does not get what he wants." "You will not face him alone this time," Kale said, his voice firm and certain. Whatever comes, we face it together. Over the following days, the palace fell into a strange rhythm, official business continuing alongside quiet preparations for the confrontation both of them knew was coming. Kale met with his advisors late into the evenings, poring over old legal texts and precedents, while Lyra found herself drawn increasingly into the daily life of the palace, learning the names of servants and guards, growing more comfortable within walls that had felt impossibly foreign only days before. Nora became something close to a friend during this time, sharing meals with Lyra in quiet corners of the palace kitchens, offering small kindnesses that helped ease the constant tension of waiting for Daemon's next move. "He is not wrong to be careful," Nora said one evening, as they sat together near the kitchen hearth. "His Majesty rarely shows such open concern for anyone outside his closest circle. It has not gone unnoticed." "I do not know what to make of it," Lyra admitted. "I have spent so long expecting cruelty from those in power that I do not entirely know how to trust kindness when I find it." "Give it time," Nora said gently. "Trust is not something that arrives all at once. It grows slowly, the way most things worth having tend to grow." Lyra found herself thinking of those words often in the days that followed, watching Kale move through his duties with quiet determination, catching glimpses of the same steady strength she had first noticed on the auction platform. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to imagine a future within these walls that extended beyond simple survival, though the shadow of Daemon's claim loomed constantly at the edges of that fragile hope, a storm she knew was still gathering strength somewhere beyond the palace gates. The library where Kale found her that afternoon was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire and the rustle of pages, as Lyra turned through an old book of botanical drawings she had discovered tucked among the shelves. She looked up as he entered, noting the tired lines around his eyes, the weight of long hours spent in council meetings, clearly showing on his features. "You look as though you have not slept properly in days," she said, closing the book gently. "Legal precedent does not read itself," Kale said, offering a tired half-smile as he settled into the chair across from her. "Though I confess, I welcome the interruption." "Have you found what you need?" she asked, "to counter Daemon's claim?" "Some of it," Kale said. "Enough to know the fight will not be simple, but not impossible either. Pack law recognizes a right of reclamation only under narrow circumstances Daemon will need to prove, rather than merely assert." Lyra nodded slowly, though the familiar knot of anxiety remained lodged in her chest. "I keep waiting to feel relieved," she admitted, "but every time I imagine this ending well, some part of me expects it to be taken away again." Kale was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she had come to recognize as careful consideration, the look he wore when weighing words he wanted to get exactly right. "May I ask you something," he said finally, "that has nothing to do with Daemon, or the court, or any of the difficulties waiting outside these walls?" "You may," Lyra said, curious despite herself. "What did you want, before all of this happened?" Kale asked. "Before the pack, before the auction. What did you dream of, when you were simply a girl with no chains and no titles attached to your name?" The question caught her entirely off guard, and she found herself sitting with it for a long moment, searching through memories she had not allowed herself to visit in a very long time. "I wanted to heal people," she said slowly. "My mother kept a garden full of medicinal herbs, and she taught me which plants could ease a fever, which could close a wound, which could calm a troubled stomach. I used to imagine becoming a healer for my pack, respected for my knowledge, rather than simply my status." "What happened to that dream?" Kale asked gently. "Daemon happened," Lyra said, a note of old bitterness creeping into her voice. "He believed an Omega's only value lay in obedience and companionship, not knowledge. He discouraged my studies, and eventually forbade them entirely. I buried that dream a long time ago." "It does not have to stay buried," Kale said quietly. Lyra looked up at him, surprised by the simple conviction in his voice. "You believe that is still possible, after everything?" "I believe," Kale said, "that a rejection, issued by a cruel man, does not define the limits of what you are capable of becoming. If healing is what you wish to pursue, this palace has resources you have never had access to before, physicians willing to teach, a library far larger than the shelves surrounding us now. The choice is entirely yours to make." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Lyra's chest at his words, a fragile hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "I would like that," she said softly, "more than I can easily express." Then it is decided, Kale said, something like genuine pleasure lighting his tired features. I will speak with the royal physician tomorrow. They sat together for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory. Small stories from Kale's childhood before the war, memories of a kingdom at peace that Lyra had never known, but found herself picturing vividly through his words. She found herself laughing, genuinely and without reservation, for the first time since the auction, and the sound seemed to surprise them both equally. It is a good sound, Kale said quietly, watching her with an expression she could not quite name. I have not heard enough of it within these walls. Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks under the weight of his gaze, and she looked away toward the fire, unsure how to respond to the warmth in his voice. The palace does not strike me as a place that encourages much laughter, she said, deflecting gently. Too many serious matters of state, I imagine. Perhaps, Kale admitted, though I have found, in recent days, that I look forward to the moments that offer an exception to that rule far more than I expected to. Silence settled between them, comfortable rather than tense, and Lyra found herself studying his face in the firelight, the steady gray eyes, the faint lines that spoke of years spent carrying burdens far heavier than most people would ever understand. She thought of the auction platform, of the humiliation and fear that had defined that morning, and marveled quietly at how far removed this moment felt from everything that had come before it. Thank you, she said eventually, for asking about the garden, about the girl I was before all of this. You do not need to thank me for wanting to know you, Kale said softly. I find that I want to know a great deal more, if you are willing to share it. The words hung gently in the air between them, carrying a weight neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though Lyra felt it settle into her chest all the same, warm and cautious and entirely new. She was not yet ready to name what was growing between them, not with Damon's threat still looming somewhere beyond the palace gates, but she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely looking forward to whatever came next. Outside the library window, evening settled slowly over the palace grounds, the last light of day fading into soft twilight, and within the quiet warmth of the fire, two people who had begun as strangers found themselves, slowly and carefully, becoming something else entirely. Weeks passed, and the palace grew accustomed to Lyra's presence, in a way she had not expected. The royal physician, an elderly man named Elric, with a gentle manner and sharp intelligence, took her on as a student, with genuine enthusiasm, delighted by her natural understanding of herbs and remedies. She spent her mornings in his small workshop, learning to identify medicinal plants from the palace gardens, practicing the careful measurements required for tinctures and salves, and her afternoons often found her walking the grounds with Kale, whenever his duties allowed the time. You have a gift for this, Elric told her one morning, watching her expertly grind a mixture of herbs for a fever remedy. I have taught many students over the years, but few have grasped the balance of these ingredients so quickly. I had a good teacher, long ago, Lyra said, thinking of her mother's garden, of quiet afternoons spent learning names and properties of plants that had once seemed like ordinary knowledge and now felt like a precious inheritance reclaimed. Her friendship with Nora deepened as well, the two of them sharing meals and quiet conversations that helped ease the lingering uncertainty of her new life. Nora introduced her to other members of the palace staff, and slowly, Lyra began to feel less like an outsider and more like someone who genuinely belonged within these walls. Her relationship with Kale, too, continued to shift and deepen in ways neither of them spoke of directly, though both of them felt the change clearly. Their afternoon walks grew longer, their conversations more personal, and Lyra found herself looking forward to his company with an eagerness she had not felt in years, perhaps ever. One afternoon, as they walked together through a quieter section of the gardens neither of them had explored before, Kale led her toward a small hidden alcove surrounded by climbing flowers, a place that felt far removed from the formal grandeur of the rest of the palace grounds. I used to come here often, before the war, he said, settling onto a stone bench beneath an arch of blooming vines. My mother planted these flowers herself. It is one of the few places in this palace that still feels entirely her own. You do not speak of your mother often, Lyra observed, settling beside him. She died when I was young, Kale said, a note of old grief entering his voice. Before the war began in earnest, I sometimes wonder what she would think of the man I have become, the king I have had to be. rather than the man I might have chosen to become under gentler circumstances. I think, Lyra said carefully, that she would be proud. A king who values courage over cruelty, who sees worth where others see only labels. That does not strike me as something to mourn. Cale turned to look at her, something soft and unguarded passing across his usually composed features. You have a way of making difficult things feel lighter, he said quietly. I do not know when that began, but I find I have come to depend on it more than I probably should. Lyra felt her heart quicken at the sincerity in his voice, the careful vulnerability he so rarely allowed others to witness. I did not expect to find comfort here, of all places, she admitted. When they dragged me from the pack in chains, I could not have imagined a future that included gardens and gentle conversations, and a king who listens more than he commands. And now? Cale asked softly. Now, Lyra said, meeting his eyes steadily, I find myself grateful, more than I know how to properly express, for the 10,000 coins that changed everything. Cale reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hand in his own. She did not pull away. His fingers were warm and steady around hers, and something in the simple contact settled a quiet certainty into her chest that she had been afraid to acknowledge until this exact moment. I did not bid on you because I needed a companion, or an Omega to fill some vacant role at court, Cale said quietly. I bid on you because something in your bearing on that platform told me you deserved far better than the fate the world had decided for you. I did not expect, in the weeks since, to find myself caring for you as deeply as I have come to. Cale, Lyra said softly, his name feeling different now on her tongue than it had in the carriage weeks before, warmer, more certain. You do not need to answer, he said quickly, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. I only wanted you to know the truth of it, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge. Lyra studied him for a long moment, weighing the fear that still lingered from years of learning, to distrust affection, offered by those with power over her, against the steady, undeniable warmth that had grown between them in these quiet weeks. Slowly, she found that the fear, for the first time in longer than she could remember, did not win. I care for you as well, she said softly, more than I expected to, and more than I entirely know how to put into words. Something in Cale's expression eased at her words, a tension she had not fully noticed until it released, and for a long moment they simply sat together beneath the blooming vines, hands joined, the quiet garden holding their unspoken promises in careful safekeeping. I know Damon's claim still hangs over us, Cale said eventually, his voice gentle but serious. I do not wish to pretend that difficulty away, but whatever comes, I want you to know that my feelings for you are not contingent on how that battle resolves. I would stand beside you regardless. I believe you, Lyra said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it entirely. They remained in the alcove until the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, speaking of small things and large ones in equal measure, building between them a foundation that felt, for the first time, sturdy enough to weather whatever storm Damon's ambitions might yet bring. As they finally rose to return to the palace, Cale paused and turned to her once more. Whatever the court decides, whatever old laws Damon attempts to invoke, he said, know that I intend to fight for you with everything I have. Not because you are property to be claimed, but because you are someone worth fighting for. Lyra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though these tears carried none of the shame or fear that had marked her time on the auction platform weeks before. These were different tears entirely, born of a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel, and as they walked back toward the palace together, hand in hand beneath the darkening sky, she allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe in the future that seemed to be unfolding before her. The formal summons arrived on a gray morning, delivered by palace guards with grim expressions that told Lyra everything before a single word was spoken. Damon Voss had formally petitioned the royal court, invoking an ancient pack statute that claimed any rejection issued without a full council of pack elders present could be challenged and overturned within a year of its issuance. He has found his loophole, Cale said grimly, reading through the petition in his private study, Lyra standing anxiously beside him. It is a thin one, but not without precedent. 3 council elders were present when he rejected you, but pack law technically requires 5 for such a decision to stand unchallenged. Then he may win, Lyra said. fear creeping cold into her voice. He may attempt to argue technical grounds, Kale said, but technical grounds alone will not carry the day. Not if we can demonstrate the true nature of his character, and the true reasons behind your defiance of him. The court cares about precedent, but it also cares about justice, when justice is clearly and forcefully presented. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and the palace fell into a tense flurry of preparation. Kale's advisors worked tirelessly, gathering testimony, precedent, and evidence, while Lyra found herself increasingly anxious as the day approached, old fears resurfacing with a vividness she had hoped to leave behind entirely. What if the council sides with him? She asked Nora one evening, unable to fully mask the tremor in her voice. What if all of this, everything Kale has built for me here, is taken away because of some ancient rule about the number of elders present? His Majesty will not let that happen, Nora said firmly. I have never seen him fight for anything, the way he has fought to prepare for this hearing. Trust in that, even when your own fear grows loud. Daemon himself arrived at the palace 2 days before the hearing, requesting a private audience that Kale reluctantly granted, insisting that Lyra be present, despite the older Alpha's clear objection to her attendance. You look well, Daemon said, as they entered the receiving hall, his eyes moving over Lyra, with an assessing coldness that made her skin crawl, despite the months of distance between them. The palace air must agree with you. Say what you came to say, Kale said, his voice hard and unwelcoming. Daemon's expression shifted into something almost pleasant, though Lyra recognized the falseness of it immediately, having seen that same expression turn cruel, in an instant, more times than she cared to remember. I am prepared to withdraw my claim, he said, in exchange for a modest settlement and an acknowledgement that the original rejection was, in fact, improperly issued. A simple administrative correction, nothing more. And if I refuse this generous offer? Kale asked, his tone laced with quiet contempt. Then the matter proceeds to full hearing, Daemon said, where I will present evidence of the technical failure in the rejection process, evidence that will be difficult for even a king to argue against, however much coin he has spent to acquire her. She is not an acquisition, Kale said, his voice dropping into something dangerously calm. And I would rather face you before the full council than pay a single coin to a man who abused his authority over the person standing beside me. Daemon's mask slipped slightly at that, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features, before he mastered it once more. You do not know what you are dealing with, he said, his voice low. She is defiant, disobedient, entirely unsuited to the role of a proper mate. You will discover this in time, as I did. I have discovered, Kale said, a woman of remarkable courage, who refused to bend to cruelty, even when refusal cost her everything she had. If that is defiance, then I count it among her finest qualities. Daemon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Lyra thought he might abandon his composure entirely, but he recovered his cold smile instead, offering a shallow bow before departing. We will see what the council decides, he said. I look forward to the hearing, Your Majesty. Once he had gone, Lyra found her hands trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. He has not changed at all, she said quietly, still the same cruelty hiding behind careful words. He will not succeed, Kale said, turning to face her fully, his expression fierce with a determination that steadied her nerves more than any words could have. Whatever technical arguments he brings before the council, the truth of his character will speak louder, and I intend to make certain the council hears it clearly. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation. Witnesses gathered from Lyra's former pack, willing to speak quietly of Daemon's cruelty. Old records uncovered that hinted at previous Omegas rejected under similarly questionable circumstances. Evidence assembled piece by careful piece, by Kale's advisors, working long into each night. On the evening before the hearing, Lyra found Kale in his study once more, poring over the final arguments he intended to present. She settled quietly into the chair across from him, watching the exhaustion etched into his features with growing concern. You have not slept properly in days, she said gently. Come away from this for just a moment. Kale looked up at her, something softening in his tired eyes. I cannot afford to leave any argument unprepared, he said, not when your future depends on how well I present it tomorrow. My future, Lyra said quietly, depends on more than just tomorrow's hearing. It depends on the fact that, Whatever happens, I am no longer the same frightened woman who stood on that auction platform months ago. You have given me that much already, regardless of what the council decides." Cale reached for her hand across the desk, holding it gently. "Tomorrow will not be easy," he said, "but I promise you this. Whatever the council's decision, I will not allow Daemon to take you from this palace. If the law itself fails you, I will find another way." Lyra felt the weight of his promise settle over her, steady and certain, and though fear still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, she found herself believing, more fully than ever before, that whatever storm awaited them in the morning, she would not face it alone. The great hall had never felt so vast as it did the morning of the hearing, its high stone arches echoing with the murmur of gathered nobles, council elders, and curious onlookers who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom to witness the proceedings. Lyra stood beside Cale at the front of the chamber, her chin lifted despite the trembling she fought to hide, refusing to let this room see her break the way the auction hall had almost broken her months before. Daemon stood across the chamber with a small retinue of supporters, his expression composed and confident, clearly believing his technical argument would carry the day regardless of whatever character evidence Cale's side might present. The lead council elder, an ancient woman named Petra with sharp eyes that missed nothing, called the hearing to order, with a single strike of her ceremonial staff against the stone floor. "We are gathered to consider the petition of Alpha Daemon Voss," she announced, regarding the validity of a rejection issued against the Omega, now known as Lyra, currently under the protection of His Majesty King Cale. Daemon presented his case first, methodical and precise, citing the ancient statute requiring 5 council elders for a binding rejection, noting with careful emphasis that only 3 had been present on the day in question. His advocate spoke at length about the technical failure, painting the entire matter as a simple administrative oversight rather than anything more significant. When it came time for Cale's side to respond, he rose with quiet authority, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "The council is correct to consider the technical requirements of pack law," he began. "But the council must also consider why this rejection occurred in the first place, and whether restoring Alpha Voss's claim would serve justice, or merely reward cruelty hidden behind procedural error." One by one, witnesses came forward, former members of Daemon's pack who had risked his anger by traveling to testify, speaking quietly but clearly of the conditions Lyra had endured, of Daemon's pattern of demanding submission through fear, rather than earning respect through fairness. An elderly healer testified to injuries she had treated among Pack Omegas over the years, injuries consistent with harsh treatment rather than simple accident. A young Alpha, once loyal to Daemon, spoke of witnessing the moment of Lyra's rejection, confirming that she had refused Daemon's demand to punish another Omega unjustly, and that her defiance, not any failure of duty, had led directly to her casting out. Lyra watched the council's expressions shift gradually as testimony accumulated, sympathy and understanding replacing the neutral skepticism with which they had begun the proceedings. Daemon's confident composure, meanwhile, began to crack visibly under the weight of accusation after accusation, his careful mask slipping further with each new witness. When it came time for Lyra herself to speak, she rose on legs that trembled only slightly, and found Cale's steady gaze offering silent encouragement from beside her. "I do not deny that I refused Alpha Voss's authority," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I refused, because obedience to cruelty is not virtue, and I would rather be cast out for standing against wrongdoing than remain within a pack that demanded my silence in its face. If the council believes that refusal makes me unworthy of protection, then I accept whatever judgment follows. But I will not pretend that refusal was ever a failure on my part." A long silence followed her words, the chamber holding its collective breath as the council elders exchanged quiet glances among themselves. Finally, Petra rose from her seat, her expression solemn but resolute. "The council has heard sufficient testimony," she announced, "to determine that while the technical requirements of pack law were indeed not fully observed on the day of rejection, the circumstances surrounding that rejection reveal a clear pattern of misconduct on the part of Alpha Daemon Voss, misconduct that this council cannot in good conscience reward through restoration of his claim." Daemon's face went pale, then flushed with barely contained fury. "This is an outrage," he began, but Petra's raised hand silenced him immediately. "Furthermore," she continued, "given the evidence presented today, This council recommends a full investigation into Alpha Voss's conduct toward all Omegas under his authority, past and present. Any further attempt to reclaim ownership of the Omega, known as Lyra, will be regarded as harassment under the Crown's protection, a protection this council formally recognizes as valid and binding from this day forward. The chamber erupted into murmurs of reaction, and Lyra felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees, steadied only by Kale's firm hand finding hers beneath the cover of her sleeve. Damon, defeated and exposed before the entire assembled court, was escorted from the hall by guards, his earlier confidence entirely shattered, replaced by the humiliation he had so casually inflicted on others for years without consequence. Once the hall began to clear, Kale turned to Lyra, something fierce and proud shining in his gray eyes. "It is done," he said softly. "You are free of him, fully and completely, under the protection of the Crown itself." Lyra felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, tears of relief rather than sorrow, and she did not try to hide them. "I do not know how to thank you," she said, "for everything you have done to bring me to this moment." "You do not need to thank me," Kale said, echoing words he had spoken to her once before, though this time his voice carried something deeper, something unmistakably certain. "But there is something I wish to ask you now, before this court, and before anyone who cares to witness it." He knelt then, before the entire remaining assembly, taking her hand gently in his own. "Lyra," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quieting hall, "you came into my life as someone the world had decided was worthless, and you have shown me, every single day since, the depth of courage and grace that world failed entirely to see. I do not wish simply to protect you any longer. I wish to stand beside you, as my equal, as my mate, for the rest of our days. Will you accept this claim, not as property, but as partnership freely chosen?" The hall fell utterly silent, every eye fixed on the scene before them, and Lyra felt her heart swell, with an emotion too large for words alone to contain. She thought of the auction platform, of the humiliation and fear that had once defined her entire existence, and marveled at how impossibly far she had traveled from that moment to this one. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I accept, freely and completely." The hall erupted into applause, nobles and commoners alike swept up in the rare and genuine joy of the moment, and as Kale rose to draw her into his arms, Lyra felt, for the first time in her entire life, the true and unshakable certainty of belonging exactly where she stood. The girl once deemed unworthy of a single bid now stood as queen beside her king, not through pity, not through chance, but through a love built patiently on courage, honesty, and the simple, powerful choice of two people to see each other clearly, and to choose each other fully, in return.